Welcome everyone from all parts of the world, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning for some of us like me. Welcome to the launch of Make or Break, and it's a digital curation. Okay. It's a digital exhibition curated by researchers and faculty of the Center of Urban Policy and Governance at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This exhibition is going to be followed by a set of reflections by invited panelists, Nitin Kobal, Raquel Rolnek, and Abdul Malik Simon, discussing the relevance of this research to other cities of the Global South. My name is Sangeeta Banerjee. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at the Brown University. Today, I will be acting as your moderator for the discussions surrounding this fascinating exhibition, which emerges from a research project exploring the ongoing socio-spatial transformations in Mumbai and their impact on the marginalized communities of the city. Analyzing these transformations through the lens of structural violence, the researchers will bring forth 4 case studies that tell the stories of unjust peripheralization, marginalization, and the stigmatization of urban poor in Mumbai. These cases, however, also illustrate the stories of how the urban poor have fought back, remade the city, and reclaimed their dignity. The researchers who bring forth this exhibition today to you are Dr. Amita Bhide, Dr. Himanshu Burte, Dr. Lalita Kamath, and Dr. Ratula Kundu. Dr. Amita Bhide of the CUPG, of the Center for Urban Policy and Governance, is one of the most influential action researchers in India, focusing on inclusive and just cities. Her recent work at the center has been on issues of urban development, in particular, those concerning complex urban transformations and their link to inclusive and sustainable development. Dr. Burte is an architect and urbanist at the Center for Urban Science and Engineering at IIT Bombay. Dr. Kamath of the CUPG is an urbanist whose research has addressed urbanization, local governance and planning, and the politics of urban policies and reform. Dr. Kundu is also an urbanist at CUPG, whose research engages with the different trajectories of production of urban space and the ways in which particular marginalized groups experience them. I will now invite Dr. Bhide to make an opening address introducing this exhibition and tell us how the structural violence makes or breaks the city of Mumbai.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta, and a pleasure to actually have all of you in different parts of the world be part of this event that we have co-organized. So this exhibition and this event is actually about Mumbai, very evident, and the transformation that Mumbai has been undergoing, particularly in the last 25 years or so. These 25 years, so we are aware of the fact that cities are always changing, always transforming. But the scale of the transformation really since the 1990s has been astonishing. It has happened at multiple scales and at multiple levels. The most obvious of this is the remaking and the breaking of the infrastructure of the city, of the built environment of the city, the creation of multiple infrastructures, and in particular modes, largely through private real estate capital. It has been talked about in terms as converting Mumbai into a conscious process of making a world-class city. On the other hand, there have been also some unruly processes of private capital which is not quite channeled. This transformation, what we are arguing, is not just a spatial transformation. It is also a social transformation whose burdens are actually being borne by the poor, by several of the marginalized classes. To name Dalits, you have definitely a very vague category called the urban poor, women, And we try to tell these stories really through places, and which is why we are calling this process a violent process. This is not a violence which is a direct violence, though there are also arguments within the overall research that in 1992-93, a huge scale of communal riots in Mumbai also set the stage for the transformation of Mumbai that has followed this kind of rioting and human destruction. But largely, these are issues and stories about structural violence, a quiet violence, which is something which is not often noticed, not often put together. And this is the attempt really in this research to connect all of these dots of transformation. The geography of these cases, we begin with the inner city, which is the story of Kamatipura, a place which was a red light district, but it is located in the heart of the island city at the edge of the textile worker or manufacturing city that was Bombay at one point in time. We then also try to look at a extended suburb of Mumbai and the making of road. And clearly, the making of transport infrastructure is one of the biggest transformations that Mumbai has seen in the 1990s. So the story of the Jogeshwari Vikhroli Link Road is both a story that happens in the suburbs of Mumbai, and it is also a story which is of making critical built infrastructure and the kind of violence that that entails. The third story that we have is really the story of a periphery of Mumbai, but which is very, very intimately connected to the remaking of Mumbai. And therefore, the story of Nalasopara, which is one periphery of Mumbai, which is not a planned periphery, but which has experienced so many changes which are linked to Mumbai, is something which is a story of both narratives and counter narratives. We finally move to another periphery, but which is there within the city. And this particular periphery, the M East Ward, is a periphery which becomes a, I would say, a depositor of multiple countless environmental hazards, and where the story of making and breaking is repeated in many, many cycles altogether. So these four geographies and these four stories really for us tell us what are the different geographies and what is happening in the different parts of Mumbai. The story of Mumbai is important because we consider Mumbai simultaneously to be embedded both as a city which is present in the global south. At the same time, we are also aware that this global south is an extremely heterogeneous kind of a construction, which enables us to also talk to and have conversations with other cities which are undergoing such changes. And therefore, our relationship with the global south has also been through conversations with Durban, bridges here, and with Rio, Pedro, and people and friends in Rio unfortunately couldn't make it. But these two cities have been as much part of the conversations, and we've been struck by the parallels in these stories, as well as, of course, differences within these. This entire project, the research on which this exhibition is based, is really carried out and supported through the International Development and Research Center, Canada. The making of this exhibition, however, has also been supported by a network of different research and activist organizations within India, namely consisting of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, the Hyderabad Urban Labs, our Center for Urban Policy and Governance at the IISS Mumbai, and it also includes the in Indian Institute of Human Settlements. So researchers from all these places constitute a network called the Tacit Urban Research Network, or TURN as we fondly call it. And TURN has been a supporter of this conversion of the research into an exhibition form. A little bit about the research process and why we thought of having the exhibition form at all. Basically, because this research has actually comprised of multi-scalar conversations, both with collaborators within the communities that we have researched, and it is their conversations and the vibrancy of these conversations which we have also carried out further, which is really important, and we wanted to share some of these things back with them. Similarly, this research has also been, as I said, about conversations with other cities. So how do we reach out back to them? So it is that thinking process which has really animated the creation of this entire conversation. Why think of an exhibition? Because we thought that exhibition, perhaps the combination of a visual form, the narrative of a story, is one of the best ways to capture the ways in which we have seen these places unfold. We have seen the violence of both making and breaking these places unfold. And hence these narratives, which are part of this entire exhibition. We also hope that we'll be able to take this conversation and this interaction further. We had earlier thought of a physical exhibition, and we began with the thought of a digital exhibition more as a compromise. But as time went along, the outreach and the sheer outreach capacity of a digital exhibition is something which has animated us. And I think we are all witness currently how many different places within the world are being connected to and outreached through this kind of an event. So therefore, the conversion of this entire research into an online exhibition, though we also plan in the future, not determined yet, to outreach and to accompany this exhibition with other events and specific outreach to different groups within the city as well as outside. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much for that detailed introduction to the exhibition over here. Now, shall we invite our speakers to make their comments on this exhibition?
Sangeeta, sorry,
Yeah.
Sangeeta, we'll just take a few minutes to sort of go over our case studies, like a very brief intro to our case studies, so that, you know, so everybody gets some kind of a walkthrough through what we've been doing as part of our research in these very different and dynamic kind of neighborhoods in Mumbai. So we will start with me. I'll share my screen. A minute. Yes. So, Kamatipura. It is an old inner city, predominantly working class, centrally located neighborhood that has been marginalized and stigmatized by the rest of the city, owing to its identity as a red light area. Not only has the neighborhood been treated as a social outcast, it has been historically bypassed and neglected by the state, an exception to the worlding of Mumbai. Countering marginalization attempts to highlight the centrality of Kamatipura to the rest of the city in terms of the circuits of low-wage labor it produces, houses, and sustains, and thus counter this stigma. Walking through the narrow bylanes of Kamatipura, one is struck by the presence of sex workers on the streets. Small hubs of manufacturing and waste recycling activity spill over onto its streets, making walking difficult. However, one is equally perturbed by the sheer dilapidation of the buildings in the neighborhood. Yet, in the immediate periphery of Kamatipura, one can see sparkling new skyscrapers and apartment blocks, testament to the rapidly changing skyline of the island city of Mumbai. So, why is there so little attention paid to the plight of those living and working in Kamatipura? Here, I wish to highlight one part of the story, the slow and violent neglect of Kamatipura till the 80s, and the equally unjust implications of the plans to undertake large-scale development of the neighborhood in the recent years. I demonstrate this through the making and decaying of a fictional building called Naya Manzil, through the voices of its inhabitants, who put forth compelling claims to the making of not just Naya Manzil, but the neighborhood and the city at large. Yet, there have been hardly any attempts at repair or improvement of infrastructure. Families thus continue to live in unstable buildings in fear of its collapse and in the hopes of redevelopment. Kamatipura is thus stuck in a prolonged state of limbo, its inhabitants swinging uncertainly between dreams of a better life and dejection as redevelopment plans remain mere proposals and landlords and tenants bicker. These plans are highly exclusionary as they do not address the concerns of the small shopkeepers, commercial sex workers, the small manufacturing unit owners. However, rumors of redevelopment, the surreptitious buying and selling of buildings, and the middle class vigilantism around erasing the stigma have not only fragmented the neighborhood, producing new fault lines of conflict, but they have slowly and steadily been dislocating and displacing the urban poor inhabitants and those who had been engaging in fringe occupations within the neighborhood. For instance, one jeans recycling unit owner in Stable Street says, "Business is down, towers are coming up. The new residents will not tolerate us or this activity." Who therefore benefits from this kind of large-scale redevelopment plans? How do we reimagine Kamatipura's future that is just and inclusive? How do we ensure that the working poor continue to have a place to live in the heart of the city, but also that they have adequate workspaces in the city? I now turn to Lalita.
Ratula, I think you need to stop screen sharing.
Yes. Okay.
Himanshu, do you want to go next?
No, go ahead if you want.
No, go for it.
Okay, sure. Okay, great. So let me just share my screen. Give me a moment. So I'm going to present the JVLR case, and the theme is the maiming of place, maiming as in dismembering. And I'll provide a quick overview and then zoom in into the specific issue of maiming. Incidentally, Nitin Kubal, who is with us and one of the guest speakers, came into really his activist community activism very strongly in the course of the JVLR mobilization against JVLR, and was also central to the research in this project. So this case is about two things. First, it's about the slow making of place as a making of place out of an informal settlement, as a place as a value, as a collective value, but against the grain of law and of planning. Then it is about a quicker maiming of this place that has been painstakingly built up by a new road, which incidentally was essential to to making Mumbai's transport network, road network more efficient. So Pratapnagar, which is this community, which I'll quickly show a map of, and from which this visual is taken with the JVLR, the retaining wall of the JVLR in view here, was settled in beginning the late 1950s by people who came in from the rest of the city, displaced by development projects or from other parts of India. And they bought very basic shelter in the form of wattle and daub houses, rows of rooms really, and without any infrastructure, and over time turned it into a viable physical as well as social fabric. And over the decades, their household trajectories as well as the collective life, which was always fraught, was consolidated. My small micro institutions emerged out of this process and created a kind of productive order. But a part of this settlement actually had taken hold on the alignment of Jogeshwari Vikrohi Link Road, and when it was which was sanctified in the development plan of 1967, the first DP of Mumbai. And in the 1990s, this was when JVLR was first built. There was the first round of the naming of Pratapnagar. And again, in 2006, under the MUTP, the road was widened. There was an even more intensified naming. So what the road really did was introduced a barrier. So if you look at this map of the network of pedestrian pathways in Pratapnagar before JVLR, you see that they really hold the place as a social fabric, socio-spatial fabric together. And you'll notice some open spaces lying along the central green. The green line is ironically JVLR. And you have two open spaces and many other smaller ones, which were lost as a result. Also, the road therefore introduced a barrier in terms of traffic, as well as significant level differences that came in because its slope had to be maintained as flat as possible to allow fast traffic. And so you had some parts, you had the retaining walls that you saw in the very beginning. In other places, you had steps. And so the continuity of the path network across an undulating terrain was cut in the middle. What is really interesting for me in this is that on the one hand, the plan of the transport network is, and the development plan is both legal and very legitimate on important grounds. On the other, it's usual to think of the informal settlement as both illegal and illegitimate. But going beyond this debate of legitimacy, what the case seeks to do is throw light on the value that is represented in or that is made out of inhabiting and turning this into a viable place and a valued place. And this is significant given the explosion of road building activity across the country in urban and rural settings. And I know from, and even people who build roads are very familiar with the fact that there is community severance that happens along. But I hope, from this case, we hope that we start thinking about the intrinsic value of places as they are made, and whether it is how we evaluate the way, the damage to that value that happens in pursuing better networks. Thank you. Lalita?
Thanks, Himanshu. Okay, so I'm actually going to tell you today the story, which is called Peripheralized or Tadipar. And this story first traces the violent processes that peripheralize certain social groups and ways of being while remaking Mumbai. The case then also dwells on the counter narratives of people who have been banished to Nalasopara, which is about 60 kilometers north of the city. And it talks about how they repair and remake their lives. And in the process, they expand city building in Nalasopara and in Mumbai. So in this particular short glimpse I'll give you, I'll focus only on the first part, which is really about how does peripheralization work? And I explore it as the interrelation of three different but very violent processes. The first one I want to talk about is really one of displacement. It's something we're very familiar with. Displacement operates in many guises, but in all of them, it serves to push people out, rupturing the places they've labored to build. The second process that I want to focus on, and I want to give you a little glimpse of it by diving into this story map here, is that of disposability. At the heart of disposability is the norm of devaluing poor lives and their social natural ecologies. Just take a look at this map here. This is a map of Vasai-Virar. It's a topography map, so it looks at terrain and altitude. Pay particular attention to the central part, which is the central low-lying area colored in brown. This shows that these are low-lying marshy lands. They are, in fact, also a zone in which the towns of Virar, Nalasopara, and Navgarh Manipur, these are all towns within the larger city of Vasai-Virar, they all fall within this central low-lying zone. Take a look at this next map that I show you, which is the city development plan. Now, this development plan paid particular attention to the yellow, the area marked in yellow. This is the urbanizable zone, which in the development plan is designated for development. But note that this mostly overlaps with the central low-lying marshy land. Therefore, it is highly susceptible to flooding every year. So the question is, this is the development plan. How did this happen? So state planners, when they carved out the Vasai-Virar sub-region to facilitate the opening up of the larger Bombay region for development, they thought only of Mumbai's needs. So they formulated a plan for Vasai-Virar, but thinking about Mumbai. And they saw then Vasai-Virar as providing dormitory towns for a population commuting to work in Mumbai. Not surprisingly, planners then marked the area on either side of the colonially built railway line. This is the white line going straight through. They marked these areas as urbanizable without considering local ecologies and the tendency of the area to flood during heavy rain. Let me just continue the story a little bit and tell you another part of it. Take a look at the purple area here, which is the industrial zone. These are small-scale industries, and this zone was designated adjacent to Vasai-Virar's green zone. And this green zone is the area in the city's plan where minimal low-rise development is allowed. But over time, with the deindustrialization of Mumbai, many small industrial units were expelled from Mumbai, and many of them, in fact, relocated to these estates. What happened, though, is, in fact, if you take a closer look, you see, in fact, take a look at this blue boundary, which is just lying adjacent to the industrial zone. The city's development plan, on a closer look, doesn't make adequate provision for living arrangements or infrastructure needs of workers in the factories near this industrial zone. So what happens then is entrepreneurs emerge to fill a market need. They build chawls on farmland, and this process of self-building involves informally occupying the green zone, usually without public services. So this, in fact, is the third violent process I wanted to talk about in the case, which is one of organized abandonment, where state institutions deliberately abandon their responsibility for providing services to some citizens. So therefore, the blue boundary marks the approximate area that has been developed in this way, mostly up to 2015. And if you look then at these blue bubbles, we actually see that this is a process of informal expansion of this development till 2021. So to end here, I'll say world-class interventions are almost always intertwined with processes of peripheralization. So to understand Mumbai, we need to understand Nalasopara. Additionally, seeing cities in terms of fixed hierarchies of value, these ideas of center and of periphery, in fact, further processes of peripheralization. So instead, can we focus on the multiple relations and mobilities connecting cities? Thanks. I'm going to stop here and in fact hand on over to my colleague, Amita.
So thank you, Lalita. And I hope this is visible. So the M ward, actually, interestingly, a ward is an administrative area looked upon almost like a flat, the city is seen as a flat terrain. And then the wards are also named alphabetically, almost giving the impression of a neutrality. But the M ward really represents a periphery within the city. So if we look at this entire ward, which is home to over 800,000 population, we actually see that this is an area where basically there are two kinds of process which have been contesting each other, the making process and the breaking process at play right since the 1960s. So this is a war which has paid the toll for the different ideas of making the city. So in 1950s, it was perhaps the idea of beautifying the city. Later on, it became the idea of freeing certain places for certain critical developments. And then in the late 1990s, it became a zone where the entire remaking of Mumbai's infrastructure, like even the Jogeshwari Vikroli Link Road, has kind of all of the resettlement which is generated from there, all the environmental hazards from the city continue to be located within the M ward. But at the same time, it is the people here who are constantly also engaged in a struggle for making their lives and actually improving their lives. So it is these struggles that we are trying to create a story of. I think the biggest thing that perhaps one should see here is this entire timeline of making the ward and breaking the ward, which starts from really before 1896, how we look at typically suburbs, and then this moves on. So this timeline then moves to the 1950s, and as I said, how one starts extending the boundary, using it to settle refugees, also to settle slums in the idea, in the objective of beautifying Bombay. And then perhaps more recently, when it comes to the timeline, one goes to the overall way in which different relocations happen. There are areas here which have experienced multiple relocations. So we look at this more recently. In terms of the making of Mumbai, there are very important struggles then, which are citywide, but which have emanated and drawn a very, very strong base from M ward. So a struggle for influencing the entire development plan of the city, a struggle for called right to pee, a struggle to save homes called Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao Andolan, a struggle called for water, which is called Pani Hak Samiti. And it's very interesting how all of these struggles have actually emanated here. So this struggle is really of constant making, breaking, which is happening. And this ward has kind of experienced this in ongoing cycles. We tell the story of this ward through just 3 examples. There are multiple layers, but just to illustrate some of these layers, one of these areas is Cheetah Camp. And Cheetah Camp is an area which was resettled by the then state government in the 1950s. Cheetah Camp is also then broken in 1976 in the wake of the emergency. And in more recent years, Cheetah Camp is again threatened by a displacement in the form of a metro project. So a same settlement, perhaps some of the people within their entire living who have experienced multiple displacements, some 20 years of making life all over again, creating institutions, creating infrastructures, struggling for those infrastructures, and only to be seen it broken all over again. We also tell the story of transit camp. Transit camp is a area which was created as a temporary refuge in the 2000s, something which tells a contemporary story. And today, over 20 years have passed, and there are people who are still locked into transit camp with infrastructures which were created as temporary infrastructures and therefore today have outlived their life. And we tell this through the story of everyday life, of how toilets, which become really a symbol of everyday life and the struggle of everyday life. On one hand, government norms which are compelling that only public toilets or community toilets can be an option in informal settlements. And on the other hand, a complete, I would say, breakdown of some of these toilets, which leads to informal household level toilets being constructed by people, but which also becomes another layer of delegitimizing and creating a criminal almost element around these settlements. I'll stop here. Thank you. I hope you will see these stories in detail later.
Thank you all for that fantastic walkthrough of the exhibition. And now I'm going to invite our panelists, Raquel Rolnick, Abdul Malik Simon, and Nitin Kubal, to share their reflections on this exhibition. Raquel Rolnick is a professor, architect, activist, and urban planner based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She has also served as the UN Rapporteur for Adequate Housing. Abdul Malik Simon is an urban scholar based in the UK and has worked extensively with urban social movements in South Africa, Indonesia, and Chicago. For more than 3 decades, he has researched the practices of social interchange, local economy, and the constitution of power relations that affect how heterogeneous cities are lived. Nitin Kubal, or Nitin Dada as I know him, is a community activist from Jogeshwari in Mumbai with more than 3 decades of experience in advocating for land and housing rights of the urban poor. Today, he will be speaking in Hindi to all of us, and Dr. Bhire has kindly agreed to do a simultaneous translation in the chat box for those of us who do not understand Hindi. Please note that each of these speakers will be speaking for 10 minutes, and this conversation, this is going to be followed by a session of question and answers spanning about half an hour. I will request all the participants to, after the speakers have spoken, to raise their hands on Zoom or type their questions in the chat box so that I can pass them on to the panelists. I just now, Raquel, are you ready to go, or is Nitin Dada going to speak?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, please go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank a lot for this incredible opportunity to share with you. And I thank for Amita for the invitation and for all of you that I know that are working behind this fantastic initiative, which I was seeing and passing through. And if it was in any place in Latin America, if it was in any other African city, so we are not talking about exclusively about India, not at all. We are talking about a global question related to urban planning. And what is this global question related to urban planning? What the exhibition makes very clear is that urban planning is based absolutely everywhere in building landscapes for rent-seeking landscapes, which means building cities in order to make possible business, but not any business, because of course, in popular territories, there is a lot of economic activity, a lot of an urban popular economy is there as well. But we are talking about some specific circuit of economies, some specific circuit, which is absolutely inserted within a corporate logic with dialogue with a financial logic. So we are talking about real estate products and also infrastructure and infrastructure building, which is related to the opening up of new frontiers for some specific real estate products. The question of urban planning is not the main question of urban planning that we are seeing and witness. It's not what be the best way of organizing spaces and territories in order to meet people's needs, or in order to protect life, which is a basic need for everybody. But the main question is that the best use of a territory is the use that can provide the highest surplus and interest rates for the invested capital in order to do that. It's important to see how much urban planning is centered on that, on building those landscapes which has intrinsically an extractive logic and a financial extractive logic. But more than that is the fact that urban planning is based on this type of real estate product or real estate logic. Also, urban planning is the language that provides the definition of what is legal and what is illegal, what is permanent and subject to rights to be part of the city, to rights to access infrastructure, goods, and equipment, and the rest. The rest, although it's named as illegal or informal, in fact, is placed in a sort, and that's exactly what we have seen, in a sort of limbo, in a sort of ambiguity. Ambiguity, it's a sort of a question tag that floats over those territories. A question tag: are they permanent? They're going to be removed? They're going to disappear? They're going to transform themselves into another, or they're going to stay? The question is never answered. And why? It's never answered because on one side, this state of permanent temporariness of the places that we were referred to, they provide on one side a way to accommodate the lives and the needs of the workers without sharing with this large part of the population public resources, public money, urbanized land, and the best places of the city. So it's very useful to maintain all those resources concentrated in few hands. On the other side, politically, it's very, very useful to have a very huge part of the territory under a sort of this limbo and question tag, which is clearly discriminated against in the guest out, which is provided by urban planning language, saying they are marginalized, informal, illegal. So it's a very discriminatory guest out there, but at the same time is the border that is assigned for two things. One, to open a space to permanent negotiations and political negotiations, because yes, there are people and eventually votes there. And those votes are traded with small investments. So it's also a very important and central political asset in the city. And for that reason, the maintenance of this limbo is very essential. On the other way, also, it's important to say that this setting of those perimeters of permanent transitoriness, they provide ground there for, at the same time, not being subject of immediate urbanization and rights, but at the same time, those are the places where discretionary public policies from the part of the state can be done. Like, for instance, massive displacement without compensation. And when you have the other neighborhoods of the city, compensation is always required, for instance, or the only type of public policy is a very low quality public policy of some infrastructure or other. So this is basic in the political economy of the city. At the same time, and I will stop on raising this question here, the fact that there landscapes for life are being built every day. The economic force and the political force, the communal force of these communities to be able to survive there, they are very important. And we are talking again about massive resources of the people themselves, of massive resources of political organization also of the people who live there. In this sense, we are talking about a divide between the idea of an urban planning, which is a right to the future, and the existence of those communities that, although they exist, they are there, they will expand, people are living there, and they are under this game of permanent transitoriness. We don't deserve, we don't, the urban planning does not permit for these communities to have a future, only a present. So for that reason, I think it's very important, because when we talk about urban planning, we talk about futures. And that is the challenge that I think we need to think about collectively in India, in Africa, in South America, everywhere, in Asia, in everywhere. It's the challenge of building futures based on those landscapes for life that have been built and are surviving and are struggling to stay put, to stay there, and provide us with the tools, with experience, with the cartographies, with the real morphologies that were able to do that over time. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward for our debate.
Thank you so much for that very insightful, your insightful comments on the exhibition. Now, Dr. Simone, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Okay, thanks for this opportunity. It was a great way to spend a few hours going through this exhibition. I'm sure I'm going to go back to it repeatedly because it is conceptually cutting edge, empirically really rich, and visually incredibly inventive. And so I'm, particularly after, I don't know what to say after Akel necessarily, but maybe some peripheral remarks on these notions of making and breaking. So in terms of sort of the anthropological cliche, the famous cliche that dirt is matter out of place. So by implication, then cleanliness is that which has its proper place. But I think what the exhibition demonstrates is that the unruly and unsettling character of compositions that may take their place in intensive adjacency, the ways in which relationships are made in spite of and because of the differences of experience and power, where one thing leads to another, and as such, nothing is really settled for sure. So in some ways, the potentialities of that unruliness, that unruly contiguity, is repeatedly and historically addressed through a kind of separation, through the notion of the cordon sanitaire, the notion that things can be insulated and divided, a separability of differences, which we now understand quite well as requiring the logics of racialization everywhere. things can only stand alone, things can only be separate through being accompanied by something which is denied and made abject. So the affirmation of separateness, the affirmation of particular privilege and the particular ability to live separately or within the sense of being enclaved is inextricably linked to a refusal. And within the logics of racialization, a refusal of a common humanity. But in some ways, it's not just in some sense separation or separability that's the issue. So extracting from popular collective efforts is aided and abetted by all kinds of interventions that impact directly on what might be seen as the sensibility of the overall environment, that generates a kind of subjectivity that's not bound to a particular subject or clear-cut representations of what's going on. So it is a kind of extraction through interventions that is aimed specifically at how and where people walk, the loads and occupations that buildings can bear, the way spaces are designed to frame particular ways of seeing and paying attention, densities of sound that obscure or heighten discernment, and goods that are shifted across locations and types of consumption. So this too is another kind of unmaking that's materialized by taking the ways that people speak, the kinds of buildings they live in, the corridors along which they move, the codes by which they manage various relations, the sacrifices they make to get ahead, the risks they take, and turn them all, as Akal has said many times, into probabilities and financial values. And these probabilities are then to be addressed by specific media content, policy, political messages, or social engineering. So you end up producing a kind of ghostly urban environment. And the ghostly, as Prasad Kaunakar, an urbanist from Mumbai, cogently points out, that the ghostly always seems most ordinary in an atmosphere of subtraction, where details are removed in favor of generalizations and patterns. So the ordinary city is a city with tons of details that are not easily framed in terms of identities or dispensations. And details make room for other details, none of which are weighted in terms of value or proportion contributions. They simply circulate, exchange, emulate, and move on. And it's this very circulation of details which in some ways underpins the very capacity of many of these communities that have been talked about today to constitute a kind of thick fabric that makes viable economies out of the kind of process of trying to inhabit. So instead of viewing partial loose ties among remnants and incompletions as only signs of the unraveling of coherence and rights and sociality, they also accord a form of compassionate leave, a way in which persons might take leave of their senses, to take leave of the obligations to demonstrate rational or coherent trajectories of self-development, take leave of the imperatives to become something in particular, while at the same time curating lives that are also specific. And here specificity is a determination to convert that which has been dispossessed and broken into potential affordances, the refusal to play by the rules, and a concession to the provisional as a way of a valuable way of operating. So in some ways, what I'm talking about is that when you talk about to break or to be broken, in amplifying the essential brokenness of the city, you're talking about in some ways of things out of their proper place, no matter where they end up or how they are used. It's an economy that goes beyond repair to highlight how that brokenness suggests its own propositions, devoid of the will to restore some kind of functionality. And oftentimes residents repurpose elements from that brokenness to dispositions that they sometimes have little interest in defining, but rather seek to perpetuate a state of brokenness as generative of a continuous circulation of materials, across different hands, different sites, and different uses. That is, brokenness here is not just things falling apart, but things that have fallen apart circulate and are used and repurposed in ways that never get settled for sure, that continue to be broken as a way in which things can be connected to each other in inventive and generative ways. Here, relations are proposed that are detached from obvious genealogy, that compress things conventionally viewed as impossible to be together, and that have no way of knowing whether or not they're going to endure or not. So as Vaijayanti Rao points out in a piece that the two of us have recently done for Public Culture on revisiting the urban majority, she says, whatever new implicit social compacts emerge, particularly from the kind of pandemic conditions, whatever arrangements, socio-political, territorial, emerge from the recalibration of urban majorities to forms of rule, calculation, and administration. Those compacts will take place in the interstices between the majority's long-honed conviction that going along with standardized rules are not going to bring a better life, that the vast legacies of endurance count for something in all decisions to move forward, but also in the necessary adaptations to late liberal logics and the semblance of a new public infrastructure of provisioning that will be occasioned by severe conditions. So in the interstices, in between, not refusing compliance with the rules and trying to at least simulate some kind of compliance with them in that space. So states are going to certainly compel majorities to be more visible in terms of what they do, their practices of social organization and accumulation, but also will compel them to be more invisible in terms of what they actually must do in order to survive and perhaps thrive, so that cities can maintain the pretense of smart machines. So the relations of physically proximate territories are often characterized by pronounced and shifting boundaries that are not easily describable through recourse to the familiar social categories: household, civil society, community, whatever. The complexion of terrain shifts easily and often dramatically as one moves in any line outward from a given context. What characterizes the specificity of any district and territory also shifts in a series of continuous rearrangements of elements that are often at times intensely personal and specific to a history of accommodations and negotiations, increasingly supplemented and complicated by the infusions of new residents and operators, many of which end up only being temporary inhabitants. So in some ways, the history of majority districts is that residents tended to always be convinced to let many different scenarios play out, demonstrate a basic tolerance for ways of doing things that didn't necessarily correspond to their values or beliefs, that there was always something else besides, right next to the amplified attentions to identity and parochial interest and parasitism, and that this something else was located not within the ambit of human and social will, but in the very materialization of the urban itself. The way in which things were built, the way in which people move, the very stuffness, the very material things of the built and social environment. And that's why in this exhibition, the way in which that stuffness, those materialities that of the urban itself get drawn attention to is really important, because that's the site through which, in some sense, gets suggested inventive ideas about what to do and how to move forward. And so in the dispersal to the periphery, densities have increasingly become a literal matter of circulation, of people moving more and more frequently across broader terrains, rather than density in terms of social compactness. So even here, the implicit social compact is less a matter of how people negotiate shared space, but how they move, how they circulate, across many different spaces. And so urban majorities are associated less with particular districts than they are with a range of itineraries of movement, which raise important questions not only about how people stay in place, particularly during pandemic conditions, but what the post-pandemic terrain will look like in terms of asking urban residents to settle down, to be settled in their ways, to distance themselves from attachment to socialities of the past seen as intensifying health vulnerabilities. So these are some just sort of peripheral reflections on the notions of making, unmaking, and brokenness that I think that I take away from the exhibition. So thanks very much for having me today.
And thank you for sharing those very poetic thoughts with us. And now we have Nitin Kobal with us, and he's going to talk to us. He's going to share his reflections on the presentation with us.
गुड इवनिंग सबके लिए, और सबसे पहले शुक्रिया मुझे यहाँ पे बात करने का ये मौका दिया गया उसके लिए। दरअसल मैं जोगेश्वरी से हूँ और जोगेश्वरी विप्रोली लिंक रोड से मेरा काफ़ी नाता रहा है। जोगेश्वरी विप्रोली लिंक रोड मेरे सामने ही पहली बार बना और आज तक तीसरी बार वो बढ़ रहा है। हम जैसे बढ़ रहे वैसे लिंक रोड भी बढ़ते ही जा रहा है हर साल। तो खास करके 1990 में ये जोगेश्वरी विप्रोली लिंक रोड बना था। इसका डीपी में 1964 में फर्स्ट इसका प्लान हुआ था, लेकिन इस प्लान में वो घर भी टूटे जो 1960 के पहले के थे। तो खास करके मैं ये इसलिए अंडरलाइन कर रहा हूँ क्योंकि जब ये JVLR बना तब पहला इसका एक डॉक्यूमेंट्री युवा ने बनाया, उसका नाम रखा था जोड़ रसा तोड़ रसा। और आज इतने सालों के बाद जब एक रिसर्च बनती है और उसका जब एक नाम आ रहा है तो मेक एंड ब्रेक, तो ये बनने के साथ तोड़ने का जो एक नाता है ना, वो मैं इसको अंडरलाइन कर रहा हूँ कि जो पहले से है उसको तोड़ के हम कुछ नया बनाते हैं। तो मुझे समझ में नहीं आता, शायद ऐसा कुछ कॉन्सेप्ट में सिखाया जाता है क्या प्लानर्स को कि आप डिमोलेशन किए बिना डेवलपमेंट नहीं कर सकते क्या? तो ये एक बड़ा सवाल है कि आप हर टाइम किसी चीज को तोड़कर ही नया चीज बनाते हैं। इस चीज के लिए मैं थोड़ा सा एक हर टाइम ऑब्जेक्शन यानी मेरा ये है कि 1990 में पहली बार रोड बना, उसके बाद 2005 में बना और अभी वापस एक बार डिमोलिशन होने जा रहा है JVLR एक ही रोड के लिए। तो हमारे प्लानर जब प्लान करते हैं तो ये तोड़ते हुए कुछ प्लान करते हैं, यानी हम शायद हमारे पास काफी बार आंकड़ा आता है कि इतने घर स्ट्रक्चर तोड़े गए, लेकिन जब एक घर टूटा है तो सिर्फ घर नहीं टूटा है, उस घर के अंदर रहने वाले लोगों के सपने टूट जाते हैं, लोगों का आत्मविश्वास टूट जाता है, उस लोगों के सपने टूट जाते हैं, उस लोगों ने तैयार की हुई जो सोशल एम्यूनिटी है वो टूट जाती है, लोगों ने बचा कर रखी हुई जगह जिसको हम मैदान करके यूज करे थे वो खत्म हो जाती है, लोगों ने अपने आप बढ़ाए हुए जो पेड़ पौधे है जो नेचुरल है एरिया है उसको डिमोलिश किया जाता है, पानी के कुएं वगैरह जो हमारे सोर्स थे इसको खत्म किया गया। यानी JVLR जब फर्स्ट टाइम बना तब ये हमारा बड़ा नुकसान हुआ था। यानी ये हर बार डिमोलेशन वापस किस तरीके से लोग बहुत मुश्किल से उसमें सेटल हो जाते हैं, भाई हाँ ठीक है चलो अभी हो गया तो अभी मैं थोड़ा सेटल हो गया, फिर लोगों ने अपना रिलेशन बनाया, फिर वापस 10 साल के बाद एक नया वापस प्रोजेक्ट आ जाता है कि नहीं वापस अभी थोड़ा तोड़ना पड़ेगा, वापस हटना पड़ेगा, फिर उसमें से लोग संभलते हैं वापस तोड़ना पड़ेगा। तो ये जो यानी बार बार डिमोलिशन, यानी इसी एक शहर में एक रोड चौड़ा करना है और अमिताभ बच्चन का वहां पे कंपाउंड टूटना है, तो उसके लिए इतने साल हम डिस्कशन कर रहे हैं। अगर अमिताभ बच्चन को उसके कंपाउंड वॉल से इतना अटैचमेंट है तो हमें हमारे घर के साथ कितना अटैचमेंट रहेगा। लेकिन ये जब टूटता है तो कोई कंसल्टेशन नहीं होता है, कोई डिस्कशन नहीं होता है, तो क्या सिर्फ हमारी भावनाओं को कोई कदर नहीं है? और मैं यहाँ पे फिर इस तरीके से थोड़ा सा उसको अंडरलाइन करना चाह रहा हूँ कि जब कोई भी चीज आपकी इच्छा के खिलाफ जाकर की जाती है तो वो एक वापस हिंसा है। यानी आप मेरे मन के खिलाफ जाके आप किसी प्रोजेक्ट को हमारे ऊपर थोपते हैं तो एक हिंसा है, ये सरकारी हिंसा है। लीगल दायरे में की गई हुई हिंसा है, और जो बार बार होती है, बार बार होती है, एक ही बार होती है तो बात अलग है, बार बार होती है। तो इन सारी चीजों को हमने हर टाइम रखने की कोशिश की थी कि भाई आप जब भी कर रहे हो तो लोगों को भरोसे में लेके करो। इसी जेवीएलआर को जस्ट 100-150 मीटर नॉर्थ में अगर लेके जाते थे तो बहुत सारा डिमोलिशन बच सकता था, तो उसकी कॉस्ट भी बहुत कम हो जाती थी। लेकिन प्लानर्स का क्या प्लान होता है मैं भी नहीं जानता हूँ, लेकिन प्लानिंग इस तरीके से की जाती है जिसमें लोगों को विस्थापित होना पड़ता है। अपना जो उनका एक सेटलमेंट है जहाँ पे वो सेटल हो गए वहां से उनको विस्थापित किया जाता है। तो वो यानी ये सिर्फ जोगेश्वरी का नहीं, हम एम ईस्ट वार्ड में देखते हैं। एम ईस्ट वार्ड में चीता कैंप की जो आज पॉपुलेशन है, एक वक्त था जब उनको शायद 1950 में उनको कहीं से पूरे मुंबई से अलग अलग जगह से हटाकर जनता कॉलोनी थी वहां पे लाया गया था। फिर वापस वहां पे सरकार को नहीं लगता अभी यहाँ पे इसे नहीं होना चाहिए, यहाँ पे कुछ और बनाना है, तो लोग वापस उनको वहां से हटाया जाता है। फिर चीता कैंप में 1976 के दरमियान उनको लाया जाता है। ये बार बार ये विस्थापित होना जो है, और आम आदमी को ही ये विस्थापित करना पड़ता है, स्लम को ही विस्थापित किया जाता है। इसको हमें ध्यान में लेना पड़ेगा। यानी ये सरकारी हिंसा है हमारे ऊपर होने वाली, हम गरीबों पे की जाने वाली एक हिंसा है, ऐसा मैं मानता हूँ। और इन सारी चीजों को देखते हुए यानी सिर्फ यहाँ तक नहीं, अभी हाल ही में डीपी मुंबई का डेवलपमेंट प्लान हुआ। डेवलपमेंट प्लान मुंबई महानगर पालिका बना रही, वही मुंबई महानगर पालिका जो कुछ सालों पहले उसने खुद डिक्लेयर किया एम ईस्ट वार्ड ये मुंबई का सबसे पिछड़ा हुआ वार्ड है, सबसे बैकवर्ड वार्ड है, जहाँ पे सोशल एम्यूनिटी नहीं है। और फिर आप जब डीपी बनाने की प्रक्रिया शुरू करते हैं तो वहां पे जो भी खुली जगह है वहां पे क्या बनाते हैं, एक तो पहले तो डंपिंग ग्राउंड है, फिर आप बनाते एशिया का सबसे बड़ा मेट्रो यार्ड, हाँ, फिर आप बनाते वहां पे वीआईपी जेल बनाने का प्लान करते हैं, वहां पे कोर्ट बनाते हैं, एसटी डेपो बनाते हैं, मरीन ट्रांसपोर्ट के लिए स्टेशन के लिए एक स्टेशन बनाते हैं। यानी पूरे शहर को सर्विस देगी, लेकिन वहां के लोगों को सर्विस कहाँ है? वहां के लोगों के बच्चों के लिए स्कूल कहाँ है? वहां के बच्चों के लिए मैदान कहाँ है? वहां के बच्चों के लिए गार्डन कहाँ है? वहां पे टॉयलेट की इतनी बड़ी समस्या है, टॉयलेट नहीं है। तो ये बेसिक एमिनिटी जो लोगों को जिंदा रहने के लिए, एक बेटर जिंदगी जीने के लिए जो चाहिए वो नहीं मिल रही है। तो ये भी एक हिंसा है। ये डेवलपमेंट का कॉन्सेप्ट मुझे पता नहीं क्या पढ़ाया जाता है प्लानर्स को, लेकिन शायद कुछ गलत है कि जिस तरीके से ये सब डेवलपमेंट और ये सारे प्रोजेक्ट जब आते हैं तो ये सारा चीज हम जब देखते हैं तो यानी यही कहना पड़ता है कि डेवलपमेंट की व्याख्या हमें बदलनी पड़ेगी। लोगों का पार्टिसिपेशन और लोगों को साथ में लेकर चलने की प्रक्रिया होनी चाहिए। आज भी जब जोगेश्वरी विक्रोली लिंक रोड का वापस एक्सटेंशन हो रहा है तो वहां पे कम्युनिटी को आप नकारते कि यहाँ पे कोई कम्युनिटी है नहीं, जबकि एमयूटीपी प्रोजेक्ट के अंदर उनके रिहैबिलिटेशन की प्रावधान होते हुए भी फिर हमें कोर्ट में जाना पड़ रहा है, वहां से स्टे लेना पड़ता है। तो फिर ये वापस एक नई हिंसा है। आप किसी को बेघर करते हैं, उसको जो उसका जो भी घर है, उसका आशियाना है, उसका जो निवारा है, उससे आप उसको विस्थापित करते हैं। तो ये घड़ी घड़ी चलने वाली प्रक्रिया जो है, इसके खिलाफ थोड़ा सा मैं समझ नहीं पाता हूँ कि ये क्या क्यों कैसे होता है। लोगों ने बहुत सारी चीजें, यानी जरूरी नहीं कि सब सरकार करती है ना, हम लोग भी कुछ करते हैं, हमारे खुद के वेलफेयर नहीं, लेकिन कोऑपरेटिव सोसाइटी नहीं है, लेकिन वहाँ पे छोटा छोटा एक्टिविटी चलते हैं। गणपति मंडल है, हमारे अलग अलग एक्टिविटी है, नवरात्रोत्सव मंडल है, बुद्ध विहार है, ऐसे हमारे जहाँ पे मीटिंगें हो रही है, हमारे सारा सोशल एक्टिविटी वहाँ पे होता है। इन सारी चीजों को जब आप तोड़ते हैं तो उस पूरी कम्युनिटी पे एक बड़ा असर होता है। वहां पे आज बस्तियों में कोई जगह नहीं है जहाँ पे लोग मिलकर एक साथ बैठकर बात करें। तो ये जो छोटी छोटी चीजें लोगों ने बचा के रखी है उसको भी खत्म किया जाता है, तो बहुत दिक्कत, एक दर्द होता है, बुरा लगता है। तो थोड़ा मैं बहुत ज्यादा न रखते हुए बस यही रखना चाह रहा हूँ कि डेवलपमेंट को थोड़ा सा, उसका कॉन्सेप्ट जो है उसको थोड़ा सा बदलना पड़ेगा। शायद जैसे हम लोग डीपी में काम कर रहे थे तब एक मैंने पहली बार सुना था कि अपग्रेडेशन भी कुछ होता है ना, लोग अपने आप भी कुछ बदलाव कर सकते हैं। तो लोगों को थोड़ा सा हम आजादी उसमें दे सकते हैं, तो लोग भी अपने आप थोड़ा सा बदलाव कर सकते हैं, उसको थोड़ा गाइड करना और उसको सपोर्ट करने की सिर्फ जरूरत होती है। ऐसी भी कुछ नए प्रयोगों को हम उसमें देख सकते हैं, जिसमें लोगों का सहभाग हो, लोगों का इन्वॉल्वमेंट हो, लोगों को लगे कि ये मेरा अपना है। तो बस मैं ज्यादा न रखते हुए, बहुत थोड़े में इन चीजों को रखते हुए आप सबका शुक्रिया अदा करता हूँ। थैंक यू।
Thank you, Nitin Dada, for sharing that thoughts with us. Now I'm going to open the conversation up to the public, and I'll just request everyone to either raise their hands and so that I can actually detect who has a question, or type their question into the chat box so that I can present them to the speakers, whichever is convenient for you. The floor is open for questions now. Okay, Shakti Natraj has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Shakti?
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful and informative panel. My question was if you could just share with us the dynamics of rent control in Mumbai and how history of rent control in certain neighborhoods has impacted, like created certain tensions between tenants and developers who want to enter the neighborhood and different stakeholders. I'm aware that there's been a lot of concern among some tenants about the Model Tenancy Act, which was raised. I would just love to learn more about that. Thank you very much.
My suggestion is, Sangeeta, can we take a few more questions and then?
Okay, sure. Navjeet Gaurav has another question. Navjeet, do you want to speak and ask the question, or should I read out the question for you?
I can read out if you want.
Yes,
thank you
please
so
go
much. Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for the thought-provoking case studies. And there are I am an architect by profession, and there are a lot of similar questions that are still unanswered, particularly discussing the case study of Nala Supara. We are living in 2021 now. How can we deal with the insensitive and unintentional or intentional thought process behind city planning or making development plan? Why always the people living in the informal settlements with limited resources have to face the brunt of it? And how did the planners or developers consider the sanitation and management of sanitations in low-lying areas prone to frequent flooding, which was proposed in the urban development? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else has a question? Okay, doesn't look like it. Why don't you guys go ahead and try to address those for now?
I think I saw Harshada's hands raised.
Yeah, but then it's gone. Harshada, yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
I just wanted to request Sitaram ji that he's worked a very long tenure on the field. If he could share some experiences regarding planning that surprised him very much, like some kind of things that he saw and thought, oh, wow, even this could happen. Like, this is surprising. If like, I can also translate it in Hindi if the question needs to be. So, सीताराम जी, ये आपके लिए एक बस एक रिक्वेस्ट था कि आपने बहुत सालों तक फील्ड पे काम किया है, तो कोई प्लान में कुछ देख के आपको ऐसा लगा हो कि अरे ये हो गया, ऐसा भी हो सकता है, तो अगर आप ऐसा कुछ हमारे साथ शेयर कर सके तो धन्यवाद.
Okay. Anil Ingle also has a question.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. एक्चुअली अभी जो नितिन ने पूरा प्रेजेंटेशन किया तो उसको जोड़ के मैं बात करने वाला, क्योंकि वो जोड़ रास्ता तोड़ रास्ता जो फिल्म बना रहे थे तो उसका एक हिस्सा था मैं, और 89 में सर्वे चल रहा था। सिर्फ मुझे कि ऐसे अलग अलग जो डेवलपमेंट होते हैं उस वक्त जो लोगों के सर पे एक तलवार लटकती रहती है, और उस वक्त से मैं अभी तक देख रहा हूँ कि अभी तक जो बम्बई में 5 लिंक रोड बनने वाले थे, तो उसमें से 2 लिंक रोड का तो आता पता ही नहीं अभी तक एक्चुअली, जैसे कि मुरुन गोरेगांव लिंक रोड है, साइन महम लिंक रोड है। तो ये तब तक लोग वो अपना घर बसा नहीं पाते, क्योंकि मैं बोल रहा भी 34 साल का फासला है, तो सोच सकते हैं कि लोग अगर पूरा अपना एफर्ट डालते हैं जैसे नितिन ने कहा, तो ये जो लटकती तलवार है तो वो उसके बारे में अगर लोग स्टे भी नहीं ला सकते हैं कि वो कुछ डिमोलिशन आ गया, तो ये जो विकास का सोच है उसके ऊपर भी मुझे काफी द्वंद होता है। थैंक यू।
Thank you for that question. Gaurav Mittal also has a question, which I'm going to read out for the discussion over here. He says that I find the idea of temporary forever used in the case of transit camp in M Ward intriguing. M East Ward intriguing. Professor Malik has discussed the idea of temporariness in one of his papers, where he argued that how the temporary may be urban's sole inhabitant. In this light, how could we think of an urban which is permanently temporary? Where and how do we place the state in this relationship between the urban and the temporary? Okay, so now I think we have a set of 5 questions which, I would like request our speakers to address. Who's going to take the first one?
Lalita, you want to go first with the Nalasopara one?
Sure. I think, so to answer the question of why always the people living in informal settlements have to face the brunt of it, I think maybe the whole of our exhibition has highlighted some of the reasons for that. One of the ways in which I tried to understand this as different kinds of violence is really to think of those 3 processes together and how they work to reinforce these. And I think the core here is really that a lot of this is informal placemaking, which is not valued. And so this idea of disposability, and in that sense, even planned disposability is really something that comes out very clearly. So this is something that you see from planners, but this is also, I mean, I wanted to also highlight, I think in the segment that I showed, that some of this is also inherited. So it's to do also with the legacies that we have. In this case, you have state planners who are all thinking in terms of Mumbai, and the aim of the regional plan was really about how do you decongest Mumbai. So the thinking was not really about each of the different places, the specificity of the places in the Mumbai region, but it was really about Mumbai. And so I think the kind of violence that kind of planning can do, where local places are not considered, the local needs, local ecologies, and how they're related then to different kinds of settlements, occupations, and livelihoods and ways of living, that's not considered, or maybe not even known, or no attempt to know either. And this is not something that happened only in Vasai Virar. So I would argue, and many others have argued, that if you look at earlier regional plans, you actually see the same thing being repeated across many cities in the region, where Mumbai was always the center and all of these were the periphery that weren't really considered. So these decisions in some ways were locked in. So I think that's also part of the issue. So sort of subsequent planning is also dealing with now this kind of inherited, sort of planned disposability. How do you now deal with it? How do you now try to retrofit is a whole nother question. I mean, I'll stop here because I think this is a really large question. I think you've asked another one, which is how do planners or developers consider sanitation and management in low-lying areas? I mean, I think so the issue today is really that it's uneven. Just to briefly say, so I think better off localities are located on higher areas. They manage different kinds of, but there is a whole lot of different coping mechanisms that you see, which vary a lot depending also on the capacity to build better coping mechanisms. And if you look, then you'll see, in fact, probably if you look at sort of contours, contour maps, it is quite interesting to see actually that the most low-lying and the closest to sort of marshy and the most vulnerable hazardous habitats are also the ones where sort of the most insecure, the most marginalized and vulnerable groups, even among a larger set of vulnerable groups, the most of those are, so that's also something to consider. So I think these migration cycles and how they work with to constitute these kinds of vulnerabilities are really very difficult issues. I don't think I mean to say that all planners don't consider this. I think the issue today is a rather complicated one where, issues of sanitation and flooding are not only to do with low-lying areas, but there are many other issues at play, including the kind of, massive, rapid construction, including both authorized and unauthorized construction in different ways, which are sort of exacerbating that. So I'll just stop here because it's a complicated question, and maybe someone else can take on one of the other questions.
Yeah, I'll take on two questions, Sangeeta. So the first question linked to rent control, which I really feel is in some ways out of the ambit, in some ways, of the overall case studies or the exhibition. But I would only see rent control, and I will see this here, that it is one of the processes, if one sees this as an overall shift in the direction of neoliberal policy making and role of the state, and creating a more homogenized policy environment through which different cities are seen, and the kind of ripples and the tensions that it creates in particular parts of cities, which are also having these kind of legacy issues, such as rent control, which are buildings which were constructed prior to 1948 and to where there are tenancies. I will not get into this more than that. The second question, which I hope perhaps Dr. Malik will also talk about this, is Gaurav's question linked to this permanent temporariness and temporariness forever. Without even getting into notions of property, which talk about permanence in some ways and rights to the kind of ends of the city, I agree with the overall point that cities constantly change, that there is nothing really permanent here at all. But at the same time, people require something to sustain. And I think the question that Nitin made here was very, very critical, that people need something to hold on, to make their places. And that requires some assurance that they are not going to be displaced immediately. That is when they can form social relations, they can form and consolidate economic activities to be remaining in a state of flux constantly, as is happening in the transit camp case, which I have not gone through here in detail, is to think about living in really a stage where neither is there state commitment, neither are people able to invest in, and neither is there good institutional build-up. So you can play people against people constantly. So the politics here is something which is very, very intense. The kind of violence which kind of take place is of course takes place even having physical forms. And I think the real cost and the human costs of this permanent forever, temporariness forever are extremely high. That's
Dr. Simone, would you like to add to those comments?
No, I mean, I agree completely with Amita. As she indicated, urbanization by definition is in a constant process of unsettlement. It is an unsettling process. And all of the conceit that one can settle matters for sure through property relations, through specifying the use and the ownership of who belongs where and under what circumstances, always requires the dirty work of navigating the fundamental unsettling process that urbanization is. And who's responsible for that dirty work, and who has to do it, and how is that dirty work remunerated or not? How is it valued or not? And the tendency to say that the dirty work is the responsibility of dirty people, in some ways, is the fundamental injustice of the urban question. So I agree with Amita that, you know, there's the need there's a need for emplacement. There's a need to have a sense of enduring possibilities, to thicken relations over time in all respects. The difficulty sometimes is that the sense that dispossession and displacement and disposability are oftentimes lumped together. And I think that's a dangerous lumping. Because in the kinds of landscapes of liveliness that Akel talks about, there are ways in which the consolidation of a district, of a community, depends upon a loosening of ties. It depends upon the dispersal of people and things. It depends upon circulations. It depends upon movement. It depends upon things being upended and constantly, in some sense, revised. And if our ideas of our imagination about social justice are only in terms of trying to ensure that those that are considered dirty people get what they need in a kind of settled emplacement, and therefore have to give up the kinds of capacities that they've learned through doing dirty work, then that is not a kind of display of justice in some ways. So these are sometimes difficult questions, but fundamentally I'm in accordance with Amita's comments on this.
Thank you.
May I add?
So, yeah, please go ahead, Raquel.
Yes, please. No, I'm just adding to these very interesting interventions by Lalita, also Amita and Simone. I think that we are talking about here about two different things. One thing is scales of planning. I mean, you see, and when you define a scale, so overall regional plan or a tiny living space of a small group, you define also with whom is the conversation and what is the subject. So we are talking about completely different things, and they overlap in a very conflictive way, I would say, in terms of registering what you have, but also in terms of the power of intervening on the process of the decision making. The second thing, which I think it's very, very powerful and useful to see displacements and emplacements as the same process. Every displacement is also an emplacement in a new place, and it's a reorganization of bodies and territories, yes. And it's very important, I think, the remark that was done by Simone here. We should avoid the idea that, in principle, displacement is violence and emplacement is the realm of good, of justice, which is not true. Because in the process of displacements and emplacements, there is violence, there is extractive logics, there is political control, there is conflict. as well. So I think it's very useful to go more and more into this making and breaking, to understand the complexity of making and breaking, and to understand also on the violences, on everyday violences that are also present in the process of emplacement. There is resistance, there is political strength, there is protecting life, but also there is extractive logic, is market, is violence, and all of that is there. And I think it's important, it's difficult, but it's important to see that and think about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. Himanshu, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, Mustafa has a question and maybe he should go next.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to add, I think it's a very interesting question from Gaurav, and very useful and suggestive responses from Amita, Malik and Raquel. I feel that that we need to recognize that the state, through planning, we see it taking charge of space, but actually it is taking charge of time. Right? It's doing so in different ways. One is by reducing uncertainties to manageable risks for certain groups, and doing the exact reverse for some others. And in that temporary forever tension, it is really what is the adjudication of this of time really that one is seeing becomes something worth examining further, because we've the images that we show in the exhibition are very spatial, right? And they have people, etc. But I think the temporal dimension is always more difficult to capture, though it's there in our stories.
Sangeeta, sorry, I just want to literally, Mustafa, I should apologize to you, but I just want to quickly add on to this because it's so evocative. We actually had a conference in 2009, many years ago. But in that, one of the speakers, D. Ravi Kumar, actually, he's a Tamil politician from one of the Dalit parties. And he actually used this term at that time, which in translation was called permanent temporariness. But he was referring to it actually in talking about caste and talking about how particular groups in India for many centuries, more than decades, but centuries, have always had to lead permanent lives of permanent temporariness. And he gave examples of how, for example, they couldn't even build, they were not allowed to build permanent houses. They always had to be kacha, they couldn't build a door. But they just had to use branches just to cover and provide some sort of a partial. So this idea then of how permanent temporariness as evolved through caste has in fact then in sort of the modern and contemporary, how it is translated through, let's say, neoliberal practices and others, but to a different sort of different faces and guises of this. So I just wanted to put that out there because it was such a powerful thought at the time. If anyone's interested, I can share the subsequent article that came out.
Thank you for that amazing addition. Mustafa, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. I have a question and a few comments. So one of them is, first I should start with my question. I'm curious what you make of through the comparison of those cases. I mean, regarding this question, under what conditions do those subjected to structural violence give active consent to the interventions of public authorities? So, because this is somehow, because what makes structural violence, right, is different than physical violence, that there's some sort of negotiation and consent making built into it. It's not brute force being used or operationalized, put to work, right? So there must be some sort of an element of consent in varying degrees in terms of being active, I mean, right? So under what conditions people tend to give their more active consent or tend to cooperate with public authorities? Is it because they are given the promise of some sort of emplacement, or are they offered an exit strategy somehow? or there are expectations built into or postponed to future. So you will suffer today, yes, but in some 5 years or 10 years, you will have much better homes, much more comfortable and secure environment. I hope my point is clear. So under what conditions people give consent to this violence? And my comment to just quickly, because I mean, the justice and in terms justice is not an ideal situation, right? It's not a binary. We cannot kind of conceptualize as kind of a 0-1 through binarisms like 0-1. We either have social justice or not. We will never have quote unquote ideal social justice. It's always negotiated, and violence is always built into it in those negotiations, right? So you can read my question or reformulate, rethink my question from that view as well. And then secondly, my comment is that Professor Simon's point that I think we can kind of divide the notion of the temporariness. Or I would kind of, I mean, if you don't mind, I would kind of rename it as uncertainty, right? And we have like two, we can conceptualize that uncertainty at two levels. So one of them is this broader existential threat that we as human beings are exposed to today for various reasons, thanks to technological developments, so on and so forth. And then, so this is like, that cuts across gender differences, class differences, so on and so forth. And then we have a second layer of temporariness or uncertainty that is rather class specific or gender specific or place specific. So I think it would be useful to further reflect on that distinction between uncertainty or temporariness at two different levels of abstraction. So thank you.
Thank you for that question. I will now read out Malini Ranganathan's question for Lalita. She says, thanks for this brilliant project and presentation. Your project website features a hip-hop artist, hip-hop songs by artists from on Nala Sopara. Can you talk a little bit about the cultural politics of the areas that you have studied? What forms of street music, performance, and other counter-hegemonic political articulations are at play? And from Nirmal Kulkarni, making needs an ecology, so it needs patience, endurance, and acceptability of conditions. Breaking, on the other hand, happens at one stroke of a line on the urban plan. To change the system for planners to behave with empathy, what needs to be changed is through education at secondary school levels, continuing through the planning education. How does one facilitate this? It may perhaps be a 25-year process, a generational shift. So I have begun engaging with the process over the last 5 years, but without much success. So yeah, so like, you know, how do you address this as a pedagogical process also? Okay, so then there is Priya Chavan, who's raised her hand. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, Priya?
Yeah, thank you. What I wanted to ask is, while the exhibition talks about, structural violence and upheaval of the social fabric through development, there is another form of violence, or, you call vulnerability, which comes as an outcome of the development that happens, For example, say a building of a road somewhere could lead to, blockaging of certain natural drains and lead to either waterlogging or flooding upstream, downstream, or, construction activities on certain slopes in a certain part of the city could, loosen the entire, weaken the stability of these slopes. And here again, we have seen that, whenever such incidences happen, it is always the most vulnerable of the vulnerable who gets affected in this. And classically, because they are the ones who are staying on those slopes, they are the ones who are staying along these waterways. So how can, this aspect, how can this aspect be addressed through the planning process? I know it's not like a one-shot answer, but, what does then one need to start thinking in terms of our planning process so that, these vulnerabilities also get addressed somewhere down the line? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Lalita, do you want to start?
Sangeeta, I was going to say, why don't we can we give Nitin Dada a chance to respond?
Yes.
Because I've already had so
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that maybe Nitin Dada can go first.
Yes, Nitin Dada?
If that's okay.
Are you there? Yes. Please go ahead.
क्या
सवाल जो अभी पूछा गया?
Maybe you can read
आप
out the
थोड़ा ट्रांसलेट करके बता सकते
ओके। कौन सा? पहले तो हर्षदा ने पूछा कि प्लानिंग प्रोसेस में ऐसा कुछ मतलब एक्सपीरियंस आपका रहा है जिसने आपको भी कंप्लीटली शॉक कर दिया, मतलब आप भी पूरा लाइक ऐसा नहीं हुआ जो आपने कभी एक्सपेक्ट भी नहीं किया, कुछ अच्छा या बुरा, लाइक दोनों में कुछ किया क्या, ऐसा हुआ क्या प्लानर्स ने जो आपको पहले कभी नहीं हुआ था?
बिल्कुल, यानी मुंबई डीपी के कैंपेन में जब मैं देख रहा था तो दो यानी अच्छे बुरे अनुभव भी आए। मैंने ये देखा कि इतने बड़े शहर का एक प्लान हो रहा है जो कहीं पे ऑफिस में बैठ के गूगल पे होता है, ये मैंने देखा। आप महारा की कॉलोनी को स्लम डिक्लेयर करते हैं, हाँ, तो ऐसे भी चमत्कार होते हैं। ये एक बड़े बुरे अनुभव है, यानी इतना सीरियस एक इशू है कि हम एक शहर को डेवलप करने जा रहे हैं, उसके अगले 20 साल का प्लान करने जा रहे हैं और आप जमीनी हकीकत को नहीं देखे, बिना देखे हुए प्लान करते हैं, जिसका परिणाम होता है कि हमारे स्लम टूटते हैं। तो ऐसे भी बुरे अनुभव है। लेकिन एक बहुत मुझे अच्छा लगा कि उसमें जो यूएनपीए के गाइडलाइंस है, यानी ये यानी हर चीज के लिए कितनी जगह होनी चाहिए, एक उसके गाइडलाइंस मुझे मिले थे। यूडीपीएफ के जो गाइडलाइंस थे कि यानी पुलिटेशन कितने पॉपुलेशन के पीछे एक पुलिटेशन होना चाहिए और पुलिटेशन के लिए कितनी जगह होनी चाहिए, एक स्कूल के लिए प्राइमरी स्कूल कितने पॉपुलेशन के पीछे होना चाहिए और उसके लिए कितनी जगह होनी चाहिए, या फायर ब्रिगेड कितना पॉपुलेशन के पीछे होना चाहिए। ये मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा, यानी वो एक मुझे बहुत आइडिया आया कि एक शहर को डेवलप करते हो कितने पॉपुलेशन के पीछे और कितनी जगह वगैरह, ये सारी चीजें। तो ऐसे बहुत अच्छे बुरे अनुभव आए। हमने भी जो काफी सारे सजेशन दिए, यानी हमने सिर्फ जोगेश्वरी में उसमें बहुत पब्लिक का पार्टिसिपेशन दिया, बहुत सारी मीटिंगें की, लोगों के साथ बातें की और 64 डिमांड हमने किया था। उसमें से कुछ चीजें तो उन्होंने एक्सेप्ट कर ली, जैसे स्पेशल चाइल्ड स्कूल उन्होंने मान्य किया, जोगेश्वरी में एक थिएटर मान्य किया है, तो ऐसी कुछ चीजें उन्होंने एक्सेप्ट की है। लेकिन प्लानिंग में बहुत अभी भी काम करना है कि शहर को, यानी हमने 64 चीजों की डिमांड की थी और उसके लिए एक भी घर तोड़ने की जरूरत नहीं थी, यानी विथ लैंड, क्या लोकेशन कि ये जगह खाली पड़ी है, यहाँ पे ये हो सकता है और ये यहीं पे क्यों होना चाहिए, उसका रीजनल भी हमने वो दिया था कि भाई इसका प्लान का वो सब दिया था, इस तरीके से दिया था। फिर भी उसको एक्सेप्ट नहीं किया गया, मे बी और कुछ इशू होंगे। लेकिन सचमुच डीपी का पूरा जो अनुभव है वो काफी बहुत बढ़िया रहा। उसमें जमीन और उसके ऊपर के स्ट्रक्चर्स और उसके प्लान के बारे में मुझे बहुत अच्छी इंफॉर्मेशन मिली।
और अगर दूसरा सवाल मैं पूछना चाहती हूँ फटाफट, लाइक ये अगर प्लानर्स की पढ़ाई में अगर कुछ मतलब आप बदलना चाहेंगे जिससे वो अपनी कम्युनिटीज को ज्यादा बेहतर समझ पाए, तो वो क्या होगी, वो एक चीज क्या आप क्या सजेशन देंगे जिससे प्लानर्स की जो एजुकेशन है वो बेटर हो पाए?
पता नहीं, यानी मैं दो चीजें, एक तो मैं बाद में ही कह चुका हूँ, शायद हमारे प्लानर्स की जितनी भी किताब है उसके फर्स्ट पेज पे तो ये छापना चाहिए कि विदाउट डिमोलिशन डेवलपमेंट पॉसिबल है, ये उनको ये करना चाहिए। और सेकंड, हम अगर लोकशाही की बात करते हैं तो हर चीज में उसको डेवलप करते लोगों का पार्टिसिपेशन अगर लिया जाए तो सबसे ग्रेट आइडिया और ऑप्शन लोग दे सकते हैं, क्योंकि वो वहां पर रहते हैं। तो एक शहर बनाते वक्त भी हम लोगों का पार्टिसिपेशन अगर ले तो बहुत बेहतर हम शहर बना सकते हैं। और लोगों का जब पार्टिसिपेशन होता है तो लोग उसकी ओनरशिप भी लेते हैं कि हाँ, हमने ये तय किया कि यहाँ पे ये बनेगा। तो लोग उसकी ओनरशिप लेते हैं कि यहाँ पे कोई एनक्रोचमेंट नहीं होगा या यहाँ पे और कोई काम नहीं होगा, बस यही होगा। तो ये दो चीजें मैं एकदम फोर्सफुली कहूंगा कि ये दो चीजें होनी चाहिए।
Thank you. Pratula?
Yes. So I think, hearing the comments by Raquel, Simone, Himanshu, Lalita, Amita, and of course, Nitin right now, reflecting back on make break, I think one of the things, beyond the materialness of how lives are lived, the Kamatipura case, particularly for me, brought together the need for some communities to break out of the places that are associated with them. So it was almost as if, they were trying to remake not just the built environment, but along with that, they were trying to remake an identity for themselves. And along with that, what was happening is, the political economy and the way in which particularly the Kamatipura is situated at the sort of the heart of the central, the island city itself, where there are pressures for real estate development right now. It was almost like as if it was a gold mine trying to sort of break apart communities. And so, yes, the question of, aspirations, there were people within the community who wanted those towers, who wanted to break those dilapidated buildings once and for all, and to live new lives, but at the cost that they knew that this would entail a cost where some of those people living in the community would not be able to live in that community anymore. So in a sense, this reconfiguration of place, people, infrastructure was happening all at once, along with the identities. And it's interesting because in one way, the redevelopment plans are in limbo. There are rumors, nothing's really happened on the ground, but the ruptures in terms of the social fragmentation are quite clear on the ground. And that I think is kind of really surprising as well as challenging to address in the way we see the multiple sort of ways in which Mumbai is being remade. A part of this is because some people do want those aspirations, do actually see themselves living in that kind of a world-class city as well. But but a part of them also see that they want to reclaim that place and stay settled where they were and where they built lives and neighborhoods for themselves. But some things will give way, some things will change, and it's not just about the bricks and mortar only. Yes.
Sangeeta, I think
Sangeeta,
you're
your
on.
mic.
Yes, your mic.
Sorry. Would any one of you like to address the question on the cultural politics of the case studies that you all have employed?
I think I quickly responded in the chat box.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else wants to.
Anyone wants to add to that? Yes. No? Okay. I'm going to.
Sangeeta, all I'll say is that for those of you who like rap, I would highly recommend that you listen. There's quite a lot on YouTube. I would highly recommend that you listen to some of the rap, especially from Nala Supara. It's really wonderful.
Amita, would you like to quickly address Mustafa's question? Why don't you just go ahead and speak now? Okay, fine.
I'm responding in the chat box. But in the meantime, I think it's 7:54. So
yes,
perhaps we should be winding up.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly ask for the last questions. If if anyone has any last questions or comments that they want to make for the speakers on the exhibition, anything.
I'd just like to say that we are reachable. There's a contact us page. We welcome your comments and suggestions. So please write in with your comments suggestions. We hope that this is going to be an ongoing exchange. We'll have more events lined up. We don't know exactly when and what, but we hope to take this to the communities that we have worked with, without whose cooperation this would have been absolutely impossible. Sangeeta, if you'll allow me, because we're almost close to closing time, I'll just make a formal note of thanks. So we are deeply indebted to the communities we've worked with and the resource persons who have helped us immensely to navigate the complex and very rich social worlds during our research. We also take the opportunity to thank the researchers and interns, the designers and the mappers, the project coordinators who worked on this project, including Sangeeta herself at one point of time, and who've contributed through their rich insights from the field. We also want to thank the patience and perseverance of the design and the programming team at Design Orb and Red Start, who have worked with us very hard. It was a challenging schedule to deliver this digital exhibition in the form that you see today. So thank you so much, Purnima and George and Freddie, and to the entire teams at Design Orb and Red Start. This would not really have been taking the shape that it has today. This project has also greatly benefited from the insightful feedback, suggestions of our research partners from Rio, the Federal University at Rio, the Institute of Urban and Regional Planning, IPUR, and at Durban, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, from our partners at the Tacit Urban Research Network Project, HUL, CPR, IIHS, and from the comments we have received during the many city-level workshops, seminars, and conferences we have attended. We also thank TIS, especially the Computer Center, the Secretariat at the School of Habitat Studies, the Finance and Accounts section for the support, tremendous support during the implementation of this quite complicated project. We've not done something like this before. And this project was also possible due to the generous funds, as Amita has pointed out, from IDRC's Safe and Inclusive Cities project, which paved the way for the initial research, and subsequently Ford Foundation for allowing us to expand and present it in this form. We want to, of course, thank our guest panelists here, who agreed to jump in and come in on board at very short notice, and Sangeeta for being a wonderful moderator. And of course, the audience and our viewers for going through the exhibition and sending us your appreciation and such excellent questions as well. Let's hope we can keep this conversation going, and we hope you will continue to spread the good word about our exhibition. So from me, it's good night and take care.